Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. The surprising election of the perceived moderate cleric Hassan Rouhani as the president of Iran in the first round itself has triggered hopes across the Western world about a possible thaw in the relations with Iran. The victory of Rouhani is seen as a victory for the reformists in the troubled nation facing severe sanctions from the US and its allies may ease in the pressure on Iran. Iran under its President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has been under constant threat from the Western world, helped to some extent by his own hardline ways. The new president-elect, who has held several key positions, including that of chief negotiator on the nuclear issues, has defended the nuclear program of his country, but at the same time has said that rebuilding trust with the world is his priority. Meanwhile, India, which has been balancing its interests by walking a tightrope between the United States and Iran, also sees the election of Rouhani as a positive sign. We will discuss today how the election of a reformist and moderate cleric Rouhani will benefit not just Iran but also its relations with the West, and what can India look forward to during his regime. To discuss this, I have with me KC Singh, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs and a distinguished diplomat and someone well versed with the West Asian politics; Nihal Singh, veteran journalist and former editor of Khaleej Times among other newspapers, and also someone who has known the region for several decades; Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, senior fellow, National Maritime Foundation; and Dr. Sujata Ashwarya Cheema, assistant professor at the Center for West Asian Studies in the Jamia Millia University. Welcome to all of you. Let me go to KC Singh first. Mr. Singh, this election, which when the campaign began in Iran, nobody expected this reformist candidate to win. In fact, during the campaign also there were a lot of doubts being expressed. But how do you see the victory of Rouhani?
Well, it's interesting. It's not just victory, it's victory in the first round.
Right.
Because that's precisely what had happened to Rafsanjani in 2005.
Absolutely.
Rafsanjani had won in the first round, but he did not get 50% of the vote. So in the second round, then Ahmadinejad beat him because the split vote of the conservatives came together behind Ahmadinejad. So my concern this time was that the plot may be repeated again.
Yes.
That Rouhani may win enough to go into the second round, but not get a clear 50%. And that is where I think which is significant, that the people of Iran have sent a signal that they want normalcy and civility to return in their relationship with the rest of the world, something which Ahmadinejad denied them. And therefore, it's an opportunity. And like all opportunities, it can go either way.
Okay, it can go either way. You're still skeptical about it, and I suppose you have every reason to be skeptical. Let me get Commodore Uday Bhaskar in on this. Uday, you think that the skepticism which KC Singh shows, but he's also very surprised by the fact that he won in the first round itself. How do you see the election of Rouhani?
Well, I see this frankly in a more optimistic manner, while there is need for caution. And I think the point made by Ambassador KC is very relevant, that the way in which the Iranian people have given a very clear signal of support
right
to Mr. Rouhani, I think is actually the equivalent of a gain or a victory within the domestic political context of Iran for those who might be identified as either moderate or reformists.
Right.
And I think the point being made that two former prime ministers who were similarly identified, Mr. Khatami and Mr. Rafsanjani, the way in which they extended their support, and they also got one more moderate candidate to actually step down, so that the entire weight of the moderate bloc was with Mr. Rouhani. So it's on that note that I'm cautiously optimistic. But for Iran to make any tangible progress, I think we have to see the response of the major powers, particularly the United States and the Western Alliance,
right,
which has placed these very severe sanctions. So I think much would depend on how the other side responds and the ability of Mr. Rouhani to deal with the Iranian economy. I mean, if you look at the rial, for instance, it's now pegged at something like 36,000 plus to the dollar.
Yes.
And the Iranian economy, I think, is very vulnerable.
Yes.
So his challenge is going to be to deal with the economic situation, bring the prices down, offer an employment potential for the youth of the country. And these are the kind of very familiar domestic challenges that Mr. Ahmadinejad was unable to address. So I remain cautiously optimistic.
Okay. Mr. Nihal Singh, domestic problems of of Rouhani is going to be quite a bit, there's no doubt about it. But his real challenge is how he is going to face the sanctions and how he is going to deal with the United States. Yeah.
Well, that of course, but I'd like to make one point in relation to what previous guests have said. And that is, to me, the real surprise was that apart from the victory of Rouhani, that the supreme leader, who is the ultimate authority,
Yes.
that he was very quick to congratulate him.
Congratulate him.
And that was such a stark contrast to what happened in 2009, as you
Right.
know, the so-called Green Movement. It was suppressed brutally. Musavi, who was the real, Hussein Musavi, who was the real leader of the movement, has been under house arrest.
Right.
So on the other hand, this is a good omen. That's point one. Point two, in relation to reaching out to the world, I think the president-elect has said the right things, considering the domestic atmosphere. I mean, nobody expects Iran to give up enriching nuclear uranium. I mean, nobody expects that. Not even Washington, despite of what they say. The question is how to cap and supervise it.
How to convince the world that its nuclear program is not aimed at building them?
Well, that will depend upon the actions and the proposals which will be put forward by the new president.
Right.
And that, as you know, there is another round coming. It's still to be decided when. So it's a question of what kind of proposals they come up with,
Right.
which are credible to the United States and the Western allies and to the world generally.
Right.
That they are not after building a bomb. Because that is the fear.
That's the fear.
Not only of the US, but especially of Israel. And
Right.
you know, the reaction of Israel has been harsh as opposed to the reaction of the United States,
Right.
which has been cautiously optimistic, and generally of the West,
Right.
who have welcomed the new president. So, and of course, the real surprise was the kind of outpouring by the youth
Right.
for Rouhani,
Yes.
who was not given much of a chance by everybody. And I think that really tilted the
atmosphere,
reaction
the mood and the reactions from the
reaction
Western world.
from the supreme leader, because he thought also tactically, I suppose it was a good idea for him, because this would indicate some kind of a shift in policies.
Absolutely. Okay. Sujata, Mr. Nihal Singh was pointing out that how in 2009 the kind of reaction after the election and how things have changed so dramatically now. What has happened between these 5 years for that kind of a dramatic change to happen within Iran? Especially the way the supreme leader came out and.
My own sense is that Khamenei understood the mood of the people. In fact, if you remember, he urged people to come out and vote, to provide legitimacy to the elections. And as Mr. Nihal Singh said, he congratulated Mr. Rouhani as the president-elect. So he understood the depth of discontent and desire of the people for change. And also, as being a shrewd leader, he also understood that people need to vent out. And this was a very legitimate way, without violence, without much of problem. People were able to vent out their anger, their frustration at the state of economy, at the state of their country's foreign policy.
Okay. Mr. Singh, it's very interesting what Mr. Nihal Singh and what Sujata also said. The supreme leader's attitude, the supreme leader, the way he was so quick to congratulate Rouhani, what does it indicate? What does it foretell for the future?
Look, let's not give too much credit to the Supreme Leader in this, because what's happened is Supreme Leader in the 2009 election
Yes.
had stepped out to support Ahmadinejad and therefore realized that the public ire for the first time was directed at him.
Okay.
Left to himself, considering looking at the tickets available, at the ticket of candidates available, he would have liked Said Jalili or somebody like that, or maybe even Kalibaf. But of course, Rouhani was acceptable. But my assessment is that this is a surprise as far as Supreme Leader is concerned. I don't think he organized the whole thing in this manner, that a majority will vote in Rouhani in the first go. I don't think so. Though Rouhani would also be acceptable to him, that's a different matter. Now, we can always say that Supreme Leader was very wise and he did all that. I don't buy that. And secondly, I think, just to go back to what you asked the other two panelists,
Right.
look, why I said it can go either way. When Mr. Rouhani left in 2005, there was only the nuclear issue on the table. At the moment you've got Syria, at the moment you've got
Yes.
a major crisis or conflict between the Shia crescent and the Sunni
crescent.
world below them.
Right.
And then you got the Arab Spring,
Right.
which was not there at that stage.
And now
Therefore, Syria is
and
very
now
critical.
Turkey.
To normalize relations with West, he cannot just start the nuclear dialogue from where he left in 2005. Remember, G8 are meeting just now.
Right.
Americans have just said 2 days back that they will start giving arms assistance to the opposition. And Lavrov,
Syria.
the Russian foreign minister, has spoken today and said the Iranians are willing to give up 20% enrichment provided we roll back some of, or suspend or roll back some of the sanctions.
Right.
So all this will be discussed by G8. I don't see Americans agreeing to any rollback at this stage because Syria is number one, and then in any case they'll come to the nuclear. So it's more complicated than before.
Okay. Uday, you know, one of the things which is said about the US-Iran relations, which is the key, when we discuss Iran, we have to discuss United States and how it has been dealing with Iran over the years. One of the critics of the US policy say one of the biggest problems of US is that it has always tried to divide the leadership, in Iran between the supreme leader and whoever is the president, and then try to rule. You think that now the US will change its strategy, because Rouhani is seen as a reformist, as a more softliner?
I hope the United States, would calibrate its own responses towards Iran in the light of what might be described as a very emphatic victory for Mr. Rouhani. And it is true that when Mr. Obama took over as the president in the United States and occupied the White House, he made an attempt, in all fairness, and he spoke about unclenching the fist.
Yes.
But at that time, the domestic politics within Iran and the position taken by Mr. Ahmadinejad was not very conducive for any improvement. And from then on, you see that Mr. Obama also found that his own space within the domestic US political context was shrinking. Today, if you look at the way in which the United States has dealt with Iran, it is true that they have not, in a way, accorded the legitimacy to the regime in Tehran. They have also been, shall we say, less than correct in terms of dealing with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
They have not
Over the last
congratulated.
48 hours, I think if there is one positive strand again, it is the fact that they are now according that kind of diplomatic respect and acknowledging the nature of the political transition that is taking place in Iran. But yet there is a sense of reticence, meaning
Absolutely.
that they still talk about commending the people of Iran
Absolutely.
for having made
And not the
such
president
a
himself,
brave
the
decision.
president-elect.
But they are not congratulating Mr. Rouhani.
Right.
So I think that is where I find that, perhaps the United States has not made a total kind of reconciliation, and maybe this is something that's a work in progress.
Okay.
Girish?
Okay. On that note, I think we'll go into a very short break, but there are several issues involved. How India is going to view this and what will be the Indo-Iranian relations under the new leader there. Please keep watching. We'll come back very soon. Welcome back. We are discussing the election of the new president in Iran and asking the question whether it will change equations of Iran with the Western countries. And Mr. Nihal Singh, when it comes to India, India has been playing a tightrope walk between the US and Iran. Iran and India's relations have been, I think once we have discussed about this in this same program, you were also here about the civilizational kind of relations which India has been having with Iran. And now in the present context, the economic security which India and for which Iran is very important to India. You think that will play a major role, and you think under a new president like Rouhani, it'll improve, and some of the plans which India has with Iran as far as its oil needs are concerned and other things will help India better?
Certainly. I think India would very much welcome this better relationship, or the prospect of better relationship between Iran and the Western world, and especially the United States. As you know, I mean, we are severely constrained in how much oil we can import.
Exactly.
And even the special dispensation which has been given by the United States doesn't cover much oil.
Right.
Secondly, we have very ambitious plans in terms of development of a transit port in Iran for Central Asia.
Right.
Thirdly, I think any lessening of tension between Iran and the Western world would make it so much more, well, it would facilitate Indian efforts in a number of directions in terms of what we call West Asia and what others call the Middle East, and the greater Arab world. So it would be very helpful for India, and of course India welcomes it. But still, there are early days, and there are many complexities and hurdles. So we have to watch out.
As far as Israel is concerned, how Israel has reacted to the whole thing, I think Ambassador K.C. Singh also was pointing out, or Uday Bhaskar was pointing out the way that Israel has reacted. It's still very hostile towards Iran. You think India has any role to play in
softening
Israel?
I doubt it.
You doubt it. Okay, Sujata, the oil diplomacy is what. Between India and Iran, as Mr. Nihal Singh was pointing out, there's much more that India. Recently, the oil minister, the petroleum minister, was talking about how a barrel of oil will, if we get from Iran, it will be $2 less than from other countries. You see any hopes of any improvement in what India will be able to get from Iran on this score?
India's oil problems with Iran is related to sanctions. And Iran is under sanctions because of its nuclear, because of the breakdown of nuclear talks with the Western powers. So unless Iran is able to assure that international community or the negotiators that its nuclear program is free of, is for civilian or peaceful purposes, it has to ensure, it has to cut a deal, then the sanctions would be lifted, and India and the rest of the world will benefit from the flow of oil from Iran. Before that, I don't see any great benefit accruing to India from election of Mr. Rouhani or because India has been all the time able to deal with any power in Iran on an even keel. India has based its interest as the basis of its relation with Middle East or West Asian countries. So India knows how to maneuver and balance relations with Iran, Israel, as well as countries in the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf countries. So I don't see the election of Mr. Rouhani per se benefiting India in terms of its energy needs, but I do see a softening of atmosphere between Iran and the Western negotiators getting a little better. And if there is a deal, that is a big if there is a deal, then it's going to benefit India as well.
Mr. Singh, how will India approach, or how should India approach Rouhani now? Do you expect anything special to happen in the relations between India and Iran? Because Iran, as we know, is a very key component for India, not just in its needs, in oil needs, but also Afghanistan and all these issues are concerned, and how it deals with the as you said, the Sunni crescent world also.
Look, firstly, at a personal level, Mr. Rouhani is a seasoned diplomat. He hosted J.N. Dixit, the National Security Advisor, a couple of months before Mr. Dixit passed away in 2004.
Right.
So he has experience of dealing with, and he's seen the upside of India-Iran relations. 2001, Prime Minister Vajpayee went to Tehran. 2003, Khatami came here.
Right.
So Rouhani is familiar with the upside, but the problem in a triangular relationship has been that as your relationship with the West and particularly the US has improved, and in particular over the nuclear issue, Iran has gone in the reverse direction. So maintaining stability in a relationship where your partner is getting sanctioned by other people who are friendly with you is a very difficult relationship.
Absolutely.
And that is what India has managed to do. And that's why there's been hardly any exchange of visit. The New Delhi and the Tehran declarations asked for annual exchange of visits at heads of government, heads of state level. It's not happened. Only time Prime Minister went there was for the non-aligned summit.
Right.
Because we had to perforce distance ourselves. We had to give a commitment to the Americans. Americans made it a conditioned precedent. They made us vote in Vienna, etc., etc. So therefore, in this relationship, if Iran's relationship with the West, and particularly the US, improves, it's not going to become pink in health all of a sudden, but as tension de-escalates, it's better for India-Iran relations, because we need Iran for three things. Oil and gas is one thing, but I don't lay that much emphasis on that. But certainly Afghanistan and access to Central Asia, we have no other alternative, because Pakistan is not going to give you that access.
Right. As far as you're talking about India's relations, recently the Indian External Affairs Minister Salman Khurshid was there last month in Iran. And it's for oil minister, the Iran oil minister was in India just a couple of days back. So you see that this relation has been kept on even keel despite all the pressures which are coming from from other countries, right? Mr. Singh?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yes.
We've always said that we don't get pressurized, but the fact remains, as I explained to you, in a triangular arrangement, you are not going to essentially sacrifice your improving relationship with West and US at the cost of your relations with Iran, and you balance it then. And in that balancing, we've had a problem in the last 5-6 years. So it is, I think, good for India if somebody as mature as Rouhani has come here, and the initial remarks which have come out, and today Lavrov's Russian foreign minister's statement that the Iranians are willing to give up 20% enrichment, which is a transparent way of saying we will not enrich for weaponization. If that is a signal the Iranians have given the Russians on the eve of the G8 meeting, it's a very good development.
Okay. Uday, there has been a constant threat on Iran of attacks by Israel, and US has also been, there's been a lot of saber rattling as far as Iran is concerned. But you think after this, that kind of an atmosphere the tensions will reduce, and there will be a better atmosphere for talks, if any, to be held between Tehran and other nations?
I think so, which is why I said that my own response and assessment about Mr. Rouhani becoming the president in August is case for cautious optimism. Because one of the factors that led to what you might call as this very extreme reaction from Israel,
yes,
in relation to Mr. Ahmadinejad and the kind of posture that Tehran had adopted, was that he had taken some very intemperate positions,
right,
and his articulation in public was quite extreme. For instance, if you recall, he was denying the Holocaust,
right,
amongst other things,
yes,
and he made very provocative statements,
right,
in relation to Israel. I think that in many ways led to the kind of brittleness that we saw. And my own reading is that when Mr. Rouhani constantly talks about a victory for moderation,
right,
he brings an enormous amount of experience, and I would say a certain degree of pragmatism in dealing with these complex issues. Here is a candidate, if you remember in the run-up to the election, who was actually critical of President
yes,
Ahmadinejad, where
right,
he said that many of his public statements did not help Iran and Iran's own negotiating position. So that is why I believe that if he is able to improve the texture of the relationship with the United States, that would have a bearing on Israel. And I entirely agree with what Ambassador Casey has just said, that in the event the Iran-US relationship improves, it would have a positive impact on the India-Iran and the entire regional grid. So therefore, we should remain cautiously optimistic.
Okay, I think on that note, we need to end on that cautiously optimistic note, as Uday Bhaskar says. But I'm sure the people of Iran will be looking at how the new president will be dealing with the domestic situation, which is in a pretty bad shape. Thanks to all my guests, K.C. Singh, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Mr. Nihal Singh, and Dr. Sujata, Ashwarya, Cheema. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue on the big picture, same time tomorrow.